Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest installment of the New York Shakespeare live series. We are here with a special Spotlight on Education episode with our special guest of the day, Sarah Guillot of Shakespeare with Sarah. We are currently in our series spotlighting educators, book writers, and other people that help us learn more and more about how to approach and to do the best with Shakespeare that we can. Shakespeare, the fourth folio, was written 400 years ago in 1623, or compiled rather, and Shakespeare was writing many years before that. So this is some ancient text, relatively speaking, but to bring it to the current day and to keep ourselves 400 plus years later doing it the best way we can, we like to consult with some of the top names in the field of Shakespeare education to bring us the how and the why and the best practices of how to go forward. We have a number of episodes in this series already featured on our Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, WordPress, YouTube, whatever, wherever there's social media, you have New York Shakespeare, and we have plenty of content. Our current series, again, is spotlighting Shakespeare books and education, and you can find other episodes in that series throughout our social media. But again, we're here today with Sarah Guillot, all the way from Perth, Australia. So hello to you, Sarah.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Certainly, certainly. Sarah, I've been watching your Shakespeare with Sarah Instagram feed for a while now, and I've always been impressed with what kind of content you put forth on Instagram. So when did you get started with Shakespeare with Sarah?
Yeah, it was just before the pandemic. I started making a couple of YouTube videos, and honestly, I think back and I don't remember why I made them. I honestly don't. I think I just felt like I wasn't teaching Shakespeare at the time. I'm a qualified teacher, so I was teaching more. I used to teach music and drama, and I just felt like I wasn't really doing what I was out there to do. And I made a couple of YouTube videos just to explain to people this is how you can do some of the monologues, because I also directed theatre. That was my background first, was acting and directing. And I thought I want to share this with people. So I made a couple of YouTube videos, and then I put them on YouTube and I forgot about them for about 6 months. I forgot that I made them. And then I happened to log in and see that they had hundreds of views and had these comments saying, like, oh, this is so helpful. So I thought, oh, okay, I'll make a few more. And then I just kept making them. And that was sort of towards the end of 2019. And then the pandemic hit. And I thought, well, I've got nothing else to do. wasn't working. I was at home with then he was about 2.5, I think, at the time, my son. And I thought I'll just keep making a few. So in the evenings, I used to make a few more. And then it grew from there, and people started coming to me and asking if I could help them prepare for auditions. And it just grew and grew. And it has been such a joy. It's been a joy for me, honestly.
That's fantastic. And again, I mentioned you're on Instagram, you're on Instagram, on TikTok,
Mm,
you have your
yeah.
YouTube channel, which you started out with and which now has grown. So you've been doing it for about maybe 4 years or so, 4 or 5 years, 3, 4 years,
Yeah.
somewhere in that range. Before you got into this social media presentation, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all that, how did you get into the world of Shakespeare? What was your entree?
Yeah, I loved Shakespeare from when I was young. And again, I don't know why. Like, I remember I went and got Romeo and Juliet out of the library when I was 9. And I don't know why, I must have just heard about it. And I memorized Juliet's balcony speech, as I must have heard about that. So I didn't understand what it meant, of course. I remember reading things and thinking, I think that's a typo. I think they've got the sentence back to front because it should be more like, the words are all like Yoda, and so I remember thinking that, and I didn't understand it, but I was fascinated. And then when I got to high school and I was learning more about drama, I remember reading John Barton's Playing Shakespeare, and I had my aunt and uncle used to do community theatre, and I think they lent me playing Shakespeare, and I read it all. I was a voracious reader when I was young, and I read everything. I had decided I wanted to be an actor, so I was reading all the text because that's how I learned everything. I was very academic, so I would go and read a book about acting, So I learned about Shakespeare like that to begin with, and then when I went to study at university, I would go and pick up books from the library, even though we studied a little of Shakespeare, but I would go and pick it up and just I would be reading about the globe. And I kind of self-taught that way. And then when I finished university, I was lucky enough to work with some directors, and one particular director that was English actually. So he kind of brought everything to us here because in Perth, there's not a lot of Shakespeare, let's say. It's very minimal. So I was really lucky to work with a director who taught me a lot. And I think he could see how much I loved it as well. So he helped me and informally mentored me, I suppose. And so I learned a lot practically, and then I would go and learn, self-teach basically. And then I did further study. When I did further study, probably the equivalent of like maybe an MFA, but different here. I actually studied contemporary performance, and I was doing like physical theatre. That's our focus was more on the movement, embodiment, strange, things like Suzuki and Meyerhold's biomechanics and that kind of thing. And I was starting to go, okay, when I do my solo performance that I have to do, can I do it with Shakespeare's text, but I'll do physical theatre with it? And then I studied puppetry, and I did the same thing. And I went and I directed a show and said, can I? Well, I didn't ask anybody because I was directing it myself, and I just brought puppetry into it and animation and all sorts of things. And I was really interested in mixing it all up. And that was kind of my journey through. I was interested in finding what could we find for audiences that we're now a visual culture, and Shakespeare is from an oral culture. How can we bring this together so people that are used to seeing visual cues and learn visually, how can they learn to take more of the oral information? What can we do to support that? And because of that practice, I think as a coach, I'm very interested in working through the body. And a lot of people really respond to that because that's a shift from the usual kind of psychological focus that many people start with. So it's a different way in. So that's a long answer to your question, but it has been a long journey, I suppose, over the last 20 plus years.
You hit on a lot of the things that I was going to ask you about because you are in Perth, Australia, which is not necessarily the Shakespeare capital of the of the world. Are there many Shakespeare performance outfits that are near Perth, Australia, or in Sydney, perhaps? Maybe there's something, but not near you guys, right?
Yeah, not a lot. It's interesting because here we actually have, I think, the only Elizabethan style theatre in the Southern Hemisphere, I think, or maybe it's just the oldest, but there's not many in the Southern Hemisphere. And we have one here at the University of Western Australia. It's not well kept, it's not pretty, but it does get used usually by community theatre actually, and that's primarily the strongest influence actually is in community theatre. And there's been some great people that have actually created the theatre is called the New Fortune Theatre, and it's a model of the Fortune Theatre basically, and it's got the many levels and a thrust stage and a pit, and there are peacocks that wander around, and it's very unique, and it has been. I was lucky enough to perform there when I started out, and then I have directed there as well, and it's something very special about that. However, it is mostly amateur or independent productions there, and rather than professional, occasionally professional. In terms of professional, there's very little. It's usually, there's very little professional theatre as it is. I mean, Australia loves sports. They love sports. They don't love arts. And so working on Shakespeare is not the exciting stuff. But we have in Sydney, there's Bell Shakespeare. They're our biggest one. John Bell has been around for a long time. He leads that and has is kind of one of the top Shakespeare experts in Australia. And I was lucky enough to go and mentor with one of the people there for a little bit as well. So I was following it around wherever I could, but here, not so much. So it's been, the pandemic actually opened things up a lot for me because there's been a lot more learning on Zoom, and teaching on Zoom has become normalized. So that for me it's changed what I have access to and how I can connect to people around the world. But I'm so lucky about that because yes, it's very quiet here.
I'm sure, but that also leads into my next question, which is once you got into this thing where you put the videos up and you got the response, and then you decided to take the skills you had developed over the years with your different experiences into putting up more videos. At what point in the process of putting up videos do you also get into one-on-one coaching?
Yeah, I think it was probably maybe about 8 or 9 months, I suppose. And I was pretty consistent with it. And I think probably what that corresponded with actually was the drama school audition period. Because I do a lot of drama school audition help for people, because I think one of the things that people like about my YouTube videos is that you can tell it's an Australian thing as well, is that we have a sense of humor. We don't take it too seriously. And because there's not that much interest in Shakespeare here, people are not, putting me up on a pedestal by any means. And that keeps me kind of humble, I suppose. And I think that that's fresh too, because particularly in the UK, there can be a reverence of Shakespeare that I think scares people. And so younger actors who are coming to Shakespeare maybe for the first time and having to perform a Shakespeare monologue for their auditions, and they care so much, about the auditions, but they don't know what to do with Shakespeare. They are seeing my YouTube video and they think, oh, thank goodness, someone's cracking a joke and explaining it simply. You're saving my life, thank goodness. And then coming to me and saying, please help me. So I started with a lot of younger actors, and that has expanded to all levels. But starting with younger actors was the beginning, and that was around about towards the end of the year, I suppose, after maybe towards the end of 2020, when people were starting to maybe go out in the world a little more and right. Auditioning for schools.
Right. So that's great. So I would imagine that the majority, if not all, of your coaching is done via Zoom or via remote.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, pretty much all of it is on Zoom. Yeah, I do group teaching. I've just started a membership as well, which has been so cool. We're doing classes called Shakespeare Mastery Academy. We're opening the doors in November. Sorry, a little plug in the middle here, but I wanted to mention it because it has been so cool to have people that this has been a great opportunity for me to connect with people that are just like me, fascinated, and probably like you, fascinated with Shakespeare and interested in having it as part of their practice, as an ongoing thing for actors. So we've been doing weekly classes as part of the membership, and that's all on Zoom, and it's primarily with people in the US. Actually, this is the most of my students, my clients are in the US and a bit in the UK, a little sprinkle in Australia, but mostly you guys. Yeah.
Given the time difference between us here in New York and you over there, or across the United States and you there in Australia, you often have to do 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. sessions to accommodate clients.
Not too much. I do a fair amount of 6 a.m., which, I mean, some people might be like, what? But it actually works really well for me, having now a 6-year-old boy. I come and teach. I take him to school, and then I teach a bit more, and and then I get him home, and then I teach in the evening for the UK people. And it's the freelance life, I suppose. It's the coach life, but it also fits well with the arts life, I think, because that's how we live. I think it's very piecemeal. So but there's also a lot of for me around about 9 a.m., which is 9 p.m. for you guys, and when your daylight savings finishes I think it's about 8 p.m. for you guys. I often teach then, because also there are people in the West for you guys, so people on Pacific time and Central time can join in as well. So we do a lot of for you guys around about 6 p.m. classes or 9 p.m. classes and that sort of thing. So not too early for me. I draw the line at 5 a.m. Yeah,
which
it's
we're at
enough.
right now. So
Yeah.
our thanks for having you at the very cusp of your cutoff of time. Okay, so now you mentioned earlier about how Shakespeare was a very orally centered culture, and we are much more visual learners. And you also discussed how some of the newer students that come to Shakespeare are intimidated or tentative about how to approach Shakespeare. And that's something that I personally have really enjoyed about your videos, especially what you have on Instagram and TikTok, is that it is really as much as anyone else I've seen, it's really very well geared towards that Instagram aesthetic or that TikTok aesthetic, where it's short form videos and you have very simple explanatory text that pops up on the screen as you're speaking, and you don't make it too complicated. As you say, you have a sense of humor about it, but it's really easy to digest and easy to follow, and it breaks down a barrier that a lot of people have with Shakespeare, that people are always, not always, but oftentimes put off, and they think that it's another language that I can't even understand, let alone try to perform. So how did you come about with the process of putting this Instagram friendly aesthetic together?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that that's also driven, everything I do, I think, is driven by need and what I'm seeing out there. And I think particularly working with young people, they definitely are used to that kind of learning as well. And it, I think the more that I worked with people in my one-to-one work, the more that I saw repetitive patterns coming up of these are the things that people struggle with a lot. And I try my best to be concise and put it into, a 1 minute form and say, look, this is a little nugget. And I think as well, the thing that helps me with this is when I first started teaching, I actually trained in like elementary school teaching. So I taught the littles. I taught the 5-year-olds and the 6-year-olds. And when you're teaching 5 and 6-year-olds, you have to break everything down into tiny pieces. They don't know how to make a circle, so you can't just say sit in a circle. When they're 5, you have to say everybody hold hands, because they don't understand that. And I suppose that's partly where it came from, was this understanding of when people start with things, it must be small, it has to be in pieces. And that's something that I think, the educator part of me, I actually love that. I love being able to pull things into pieces and to create a structure for things that we can begin here and we can layer on things. And with Shakespeare, of course, there are many steps and it is complicated and it is non-linear a lot of the time, but there are things that everybody can do that you can look at piece by piece. And I suppose that's where it came from. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely, and I applaud you, because it's perhaps the most Instagram friendly set of instructional videos that I've seen from anyone doing Shakespeare. So I think you're doing a fantastic job, and you're really targeting that audience in a great way. The people that you work with, would you say that you have all ends of the spectrum, from beginner to intermediate to advanced students?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I have a lot of beginners, particularly because of the drama school things and the grad school. Then working with grad school, that becomes more like intermediate. And then I do have more advanced, like I work with people that have studied they've gone through classical training, with different schools or different programs like Shakespeare and Company, lots of different levels. And it's amazing how a lot of it, actually, they have things in common. There are things that I think that apply across all levels. And then, of course, there's things that are just particular for beginners. Yeah, that's something. Shall I chat more about that?
Sure. Well, why don't you give us a quick sample tip of what you would teach a beginner, what would you teach an intermediate and an advanced?
Yeah. Yeah, good question. Actually, I'll tell you one of the things that I'm passionate about across all levels that I think people don't look enough at, even for experience, and I'll tell you how it applies at different levels, it's paraphrasing, I call it translating, because I think it's useful to think of Shakespeare as a different language, because I remember the director that I used to work with, that taught me many things. He was telling us about the stats around when you've got something like Austen, for example, or a similar kind of period where we're watching that, the audience will understand something like 90%, where when it's Shakespeare, I think it's under 50% of what we're hearing, we're actually understanding, and for an average audience. So I think it's useful to think of Shakespeare as a different language, especially when you're coming towards it and thinking, when you're coming to it fresh, I mean. One of the things that I think people skim over is putting it into their own words. And this is something that I've come back to now since doing this coaching. I have refreshed this in my own practice and seen the difference, because when we put it into our own words, and I've got a very specific, rigorous process for doing this, where we look at even the syntax, and we pick apart the syntax and put everything in order and put everything very specifically into words that mean something to you, that changes the way that we connect. And it's more specific, because beginner actors won't understand what it means. And if they skip that step of putting it into their own words, there's absolutely no connection, no clarity. They don't know what they're saying. And they make mistakes where they will think that there's a shift in the middle of a sentence, for example, because the syntax is so strange. They think, oh, this is a new thought, and it's not. And then they can't perform. They'll perform it in a way where an audition panel, for example, will see red flags where they'll go, oh, they thought there was a thought there and there's not. They're breathing in the middle of a sentence in a strange way, for example. And then intermediate, there's this interesting thing that happens, I think, in the middle ground, which I think is a Dunning-Kruger effect, where you sort of like, as you get better at something, you think that you kind of know everything. And then the more you know you don't know. So there's an interesting thing that happens in the intermediate level where people go, oh yeah, I get it. I know what it means. And I'm like, but that's not enough. That's actually not enough. To act it well, you have to be specific and you have to be connected, and it has to be at the word level. You have to pick apart every single word, and going deeply into the translation process changes that attitude from, yeah, I get it, because you can't act an idea, right? You can't be acting broadly. That's bad acting. It's when we're getting broad. So to be specific, to be good at it, you have to go deeper. And even I think for people that are more advanced in it, again, it's that kind of bringing it back to not being, I mean, lazy seems harsh, but it is a laziness even for me. It's just kind of like, oh yeah, we know it, we understand it already. We read Shakespeare like this and we get it. Having to come back to that process and say, but how can I reconnect? So putting it into our own words in a powerful, powerful way and being very, very specific about it. Those are the things that I think I push at every level, and I'm pretty tough on people in those ways and go, well, no, you don't know what that word means. You're not connected. There's a gap there. Because we can't move forward without that. But I think moving into the more, like if I go a bit deeper on that, intermediate stuff, it's more about it's phrasing and breath and how to breathe with verse line endings, because many people don't teach that. It's many people that have done a lot of practice don't know how to breathe with verse line endings in a way that's very fresh and keeps the flow going. That has been transformative for me. I learned that through somebody that does original practice. There was a guy that came, he's from France, and he does workshops. His name's Colin David Rees. He luckily came to Perth and took me down this rabbit hole of folio and working with the verse lines and not breathing in the middle of lines and seeing what happens. That's something that I work with the intermediate, and then expert level, let's say. It's more about like, let's work on scansion together, because I think even if you're expert, so for those of you that are listening that are used to working at this level, you'll know that you might have a process for scansion, but it's quite useful to have someone to bounce off when it comes to scansion, I find, because it's not cut or dried. It's not black or white. And I think that's something that scares people, is I think, I don't want to get the scansion wrong. there isn't a right or a wrong. You have to make a choice. You have to be brave. So there's a lot of courage involved in Shakespeare generally, I think. And when you're at that higher level, I think that's the thing that you can work on together and kind of go, well, what's working best for scansion? What's working best for breath? And embodiment practice, getting back into the body actually that's everybody. Everybody needs to get back into the body, especially because we're used to being on Zoom, we're used to being in a box, we're used to self-tapes, and we're used to being in our heads. And we all have to get back into the body. And that's a sociocultural thing as well as an acting thing. Yeah. So that, I mean, that's a lot of stuff. Yeah.
No, that's a great breakdown. And I think that's a really appropriate set of stages from beginner to intermediate to a little bit more advanced and then to an expert level, that these are all really important steps to develop your skill set and to further yourself once you're even at that higher level. So that's really fantastic. So Sarah, you mentioned the first folio that the gentleman that you learned from he introduced you to, or that he got you further deep into. Do you have at this point a preference for first folio versus other Shakespeare text, or does it not make a difference to you?
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because I feel like this is like everyone has their favorite. I'm an Arden girl. I gotta say, I'm an Arden girl because that's actually where I started, and that the director that first taught me, he told us, "Oh, go and get an Arden." And I love the detail because I love a lot of beginners. For example, I would say to them, go and use a Cambridge or an Oxford generally, or a Folger. If you're a little newer, I think they're less overwhelming. But for me, I can't work without the Arden's detail. Folio stuff, first folio stuff, I am still on my journey with that. But I think one of the things that's useful is the punctuation. I think that the more you go into your journey with Shakespeare and the more you learn about it, the first folio is what's going to tell you more about those breaths and the scansion, and it's the punctuation that makes a difference there. Whereas when you're working with other editions, I usually say to people, the punctuation is not your guide as to how you breathe and as to how you move and phrase and think. The verse line is. You still have to think about the punctuation, which is it's a hard balance. But when you're really questioning things and you want to go deeper, it's the first folio will give you the punctuation and guidance if in doubt. And so that for me is the next stage of my journey. I think is more for first folio work. I'm really looking forward to bringing that into my practice even more because I've been a stubborn Arden girl for a long time.
Okay, all right. So how many posts do you put out a week typically?
Varies wildly, I've got to say, depending on how how busy I am with my coaching and with my son. But usually I would say on Instagram, I try and do, say, 3 or 4 a week. And particularly now that we're going into drama school season, it picks up. So it's more like 3, 4, 5 a week. But in the quieter periods, it's more like 2 or 3. And then YouTube, I try and do 1 a week. However, that has been a little bit hit and miss as well. But there's a lot on YouTube, actually. So if you have beginners in your audience, that's a good place to start with my YouTube and then Instagram, if you love it as part of your practice. And if I'm allowed to say, I've got a Facebook group that is called Joyful Shakespeare Society. So if people want to come and it's a good place to interact. It's a really lovely community, and I've been doing more lives there as well, where I've been going deeper into the technique, and it's been a great place to ask questions and look at more specific elements on a slightly longer form version. So depending on what people need, I'm all over the place where you can find me.
Well, that's great. So that leads us right into our next thing, which is plugs. Let us find out from you, Sarah, where people can connect with you. You mentioned the Facebook group, and you said it's the Joyful Shakespeare Society, or not?
Yeah,
Joyful Shakespeare Society. That's on Shakespeare on Facebook groups. And where can people find you elsewhere, Sarah?
Yeah, so on Instagram, I'm at Shakespeare with Sarah, and Shakespeare with Sarah on YouTube, and my website also has blogs and stuff on it that you can have a look, which is shakespearewithsarah.com. So I'm fairly consistent. So and TikTok as well. So TikTok, I'm doing a lot of drama school related content on TikTok, particularly, and I talk a lot about monologues specifically, which have their own kind of set of rules. So that's kind of my jam as well. So a lot of that's coming out as well. So if people are monologue focused, or you're preparing, even if it's not drama school, preparing for festivals and things like that, that's a lot of what I do as well. So your preferred social media platform, I will be there, Shakespeare with Sarah, and Facebook is Joyful Shakespeare Society.
Okay, you heard it here. Connect with Sarah Guillot across social media, Instagram, TikTok, and her website, all Shakespeare with Sarah. And she's got the Facebook group, Joyful Shakespeare Society. Did I get that right? Okay.
Yeah,
And of course, you can connect with her on her website. You can email her and find out more about how, if you are out there and you're looking for help with your monologues, with your Shakespeare acting, Sarah is a wonderful, wonderful resource to go to, so you can connect with her and get that going. Sarah, I thank you so much for taking the time, early morning, bright and early, to chat with us here today. And I wish you the best of luck going forward. Keep on putting out the great content that you're putting out, and we will be sure to spotlight you wherever we see you across social media. Thank you and have a great day. Shakespeare audience out there, connect with us across social media as well. New York Shakespeare on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, WordPress, TikTok. We're not on TikTok also. And anywhere else, anywhere there's social media, you can find New York Shakespeare. That's either NY Shakespeare or New York Shakespeare spelled out on the rare occasion. And support your local Shakespeare, whatever that means for you, whether that's going to performances, getting coaching, getting the latest book releases, or whatever it is. Support your local Shakespeare. And we will see you the next time with our next installment of our Spotlight on Education from the New York Shakespeare social media feeds. My name is Rodney Hakeem. Have a great evening.